So yeah, thanks everybody for checking this out. I appreciate it. You're in hot JAMS parentheses tack, and I'm going to talk about a music discovery app that I built to learn more about Decoupled Drupal and also React. It's a little small on this big giant screen, but there's a GitHub repository at that URL. I can also post it on Twitter. But that has the source code for this. There's a link to the live app, and then also this slide deck. So if you're interested, that would be where I recommend you go to get other stuff. So I am Brian Perry. I'm an interactive developer at HS2 Solutions. I live in Palatine, out in the suburbs. Kind of a popular opinion these days, I would say, but I am a lover of all things component and component-driven. So building with components in Drupal, component-based theming, pattern libraries like Pattern Lab, and then increasingly becoming more interested in JavaScript-based approaches to building with components like React. And I also love all things Nintendo. So if you guys are playing anything cool on Switch, track me down. Let's talk about it. And I'm on the internet in various places. I'm Brian Perry on Drupal.org, Brian Comedy on Twitter, and most importantly, Brian on the Nintendo Network. So I work for HS2 Solutions. I'm not the best necessarily at these company info slide things, but the thing that I just like to say is that we have a nice, great Drupal team. I get to learn a lot of awesome stuff from my teammates. So if you're looking to do great Drupal work, we're often hiring. And if you need great Drupal work done, I'm sure we would love to do it for you. Oh, there's that flicker again. I see what you're saying. So what we're going to talk about is this project that I took on to kind of learn more about Decoupled Drupal and React. And it was kind of something that I fell into, as oftentimes is the case with good side projects. So this is from the song Tonight by LCD Sound System, which is one of my favorite albums of the year. I'm a big LCD Sound System fan, but part of the lyric is that luck is always better than skill at things, and I think this was definitely a case where I kind of fell into some of this. So let's talk about how we got here. This is me. I used to perform comedy. I'm doing my solo musical show, Briami Sound Machine here. Well, it's relevant for a few reasons, but one is that all comedians secretly would rather be in a band, and I was one of those people. Never quite was, but for this moment in time, maybe I felt like I was. But performing out in Boston, I collaborated with a comedian named Chris Duffy, and he happened to go to college with one of the folks behind this podcast called Switched on Pop, which is a great podcast. I encourage you to check it out. So what they do is they focus on like the modern pop landscape and break down current pop songs and why they work musically, often from like a musicologist perspective or more of kind of like a classical approach. It's a really awesome podcast. A while ago at this point, I was listening to an episode of the show, and they had a guest on, Rob Mitchum, who's also from the Chicago area, as it turns out. But one of the things that he does, and that he was on the podcast to talk about, he maintains every year a Google Spreadsheet where he aggregates all of the best of lists in music. So he creates a big master best of list to have the undeniable overall critical consensus for the year. This is what that spreadsheet looks like. To some, this may look beautiful. To others, it may look like a horrible, panic-inducing Google spreadsheet. But there's a lot of great data in here. All the albums, the different genres, where everything ranks in all the lists. And then farther down in the spreadsheet, there's stuff like averages and a calculation for like a critical consensus score. Really awesome data in there. So I kind of had in the back of my head for a while, like I'd love to find something to do with that awesome data set. And then you can barely see it in the background. I think this is Dries at DrupalCon being attacked by a bird. But I heard so much talk in the community about decoupling and progressively decoupling or fully decoupling things. And we don't really say headless anymore, but that was a thing for a while too. But so much talk about Decoupled and Decoupled Drupal, and I'd had some limited experience with it on projects, but definitely wanted to learn more about the approaches that were becoming popular in the community. And then also, in big, giant, bold letters from the front-end framework world, I heard so much stuff about React. and things like React and Redux. And there are other frameworks that I'm sure are great, like Vue, but I just heard so much noise about React. And also had some experience with Angular and wasn't really all that thrilled with it, so I was kind of curious, is it the frameworks, is it me? So I was anxious to do more with React. So all that kind of came together and was bouncing around in the back of my head. And it seemed like I had an opportunity to try to take that cool data set, learn more about Decoupled Drupal, and learn more about React if I took all this stuff and slammed it together. So that's what I did and what we'll talk about. So, kind of starting from the beginning at that point, I had to ask myself, what sort of decoupled architecture am I going to follow? How am I going to set this up? Some of these lyrics are slight stretches, but this is the phase of the project where we're kind of really plotting things out. And I also wanted to include this because I really appreciate that this guy still lives and dies by the bucket hat. That's a nice style choice that I can stand by. So we have a few different flavors of our coupled or decoupled versions of Drupal. So there's fully coupled, where it's all Drupal all the time. So Drupal handles the rendering of your page and all the things that we know and love for Drupal. And we can build on top with contributed things, but it's still a PHP CMS at the end of the day. And then we could progressively decouple. So this is still Drupal that renders the shell of the page, but we're strategically sprinkling in some of the JavaScript or JavaScript framework magic, be it in blocks or certain components on the page, or even still Drupal renders the page, but then the framework takes over. And then there is fully decoupled. So here, your JavaScript framework is what actually renders the page. And it is going to communicate with Drupal via an API to get the content that it needs. So this is pretty small on this screen, but Dries has a series of how to decouple posts. Most recently, there was how to decouple in 2018, which is great because it's 2018. I don't want to do the 2017 version of that. It's definitely worth reading, but what this portion of the flowchart just kind of calls out is that it's not really a black and white decision where you might fall on the coupled to fully decoupled spectrum. And you kind of have to ask a lot of questions. So there are things that are editorial needs or things that Drupal is going to give you that's really important to your project or the people who are going to be maintaining content. So the editorial experience, being able to easily preview content. Then we can also think about just some of the things that Drupal gives us that we potentially take for granted, like routing or accessibility in its markup, or some of the security things that Drupal is going to take care of that we don't have to worry about. So going from fully coupled Drupal, the further you go over into something that is fully decoupled, you're losing out on some of those niceties and you gain the responsibility of that. But on the other end of things, you potentially gain some things in developer convenience, or if you have a team that is already very familiar with JavaScript or these JavaScript frameworks, it might be easier for them to do some of this work. But for this particular project, it wasn't that difficult of a choice for me. I went with a fully decoupled approach for a couple of reasons. I don't really have any editorial needs here, or at least very few of them. It's nice to be able to edit things in the Drupal UI, but the data that's in the spreadsheet is really the magic here. There's a few things I want to add to it, but I'm not going to write a 12-page story about anything. And I also wanted to kind of force myself to go all in and learn more about React and kind of cut some of my comfortable Drupal parachute. So I went fully decoupled. And then we need to figure out, okay, how are we actually going to use Drupal to achieve that? And there's a few different distributions. This is a lyric from SZA's album. I'm either saying that wrong or the fact that there's no way for me to say that and sound cool, but either way. So her album was the #2 critical consensus of the year, but I think this potentially applies to using a distribution. Maybe I should pray a little harder or work a little smarter. And potentially these distributions might help you work a little smarter. So, over, I think, just the past year, there's been a whole lot of movement in the community on these distributions. It's crazy to think that it's only been a year. But there is Reservoir, which is Acquia's API-first distribution. There's also Headless Lightning, which I've only tinkered with just a little bit. But it might be something you consider if you already use Lightning or familiar with Lightning. I find that it lands kind of somewhere in between Reservoir and Contenta in kind of how it functions and what it offers. Then there's Contenta, which is another distribution that's driven, community-driven distribution. And then I'm sure there's some things that each of those distributions do for you, but at the end of the day, a lot of that stuff is still contributed modules that they set up in a particular way. So you can still roll your own or layer that into a Drupal 8 project. So for those who haven't played around with these distributions, we can take a look at a few things that they have in common. One is that they have API-focused admin UIs, unsurprisingly. So we've got Contenta's menu up at the top, and we see things like content models and API. And then Reservoir is down at the bottom, and we still see content models and API. But you can see that the menu there is much more stripped down. And that's probably the biggest difference between the two distributions, that Reservoir is intentionally kind of the minimalist approach, and they're trying to build something that maybe somebody who's less familiar with Drupal can install and have this API out of the box, and they don't have to, deal with Drupalisms, or they're not looking to really extend this and change this in a lot of ways. And then they both offer some automatic API documentation using OpenAPI and Redoc, I believe. So here we see all of the endpoints that we can interact with, examples of the responses, how we can filter and query. Really great. And then they both also use JSON API by default. So we get a nice JSON response back when we hit one of those endpoints. It uses the JSON API standard, which lets us get more data in a single response without having to chain together multiple endpoints. It's kind of been it seems like the kind of default standard in the community recently is using JSON API rather than the core REST modules. So just a little bit more about each of these approaches and why I think you might choose one over the other. There's Reservoir. They also have their own cool logos and slogans, which I appreciate. So Reservoir is the back end for your front end, and you might go for Reservoir if you want kind of the quickest approach to having a Drupal-based API. And nodes and node types alone are going to meet your needs. And then also, you don't know of or won't miss kind of some of the Drupalisms and Drupal approaches to extending and configuring things. So Contenta makes your content happy. It's very smiley. And you might go for Contenta if you want to use things like vocabularies or media or some of the other things that you're familiar with in Drupal that Reservoir isn't necessarily set to use out of the box. And you do want a more Drupal-like approach to adding additional modules and customizing things and having more flexibility and more options. Reservoir can do it, but the UI is definitely not focused on that. And then also, Contenta has example content that it ships with and a number of consumers and reference implementations that you can use. So if you want something to experiment with or examples to start from, that's also a great reason to pick it. And also, it seems to have a lot of momentum recently in the community, too. And then you can totally roll your own if you're a DIY person. The pieces of the puzzle here are often contributed modules and not necessarily magic. But I would encourage you to ask yourself, could you play a little harder and work a little smarter? So could these distributions help you out? Or is there something custom about your project that you need to be able to build these in a specific way? Or do you need to layer some of this functionality onto an existing project and you can't really just wipe it away and start with one of these distributions? So I picked Reservoir. I had really simple needs. I just wanted an API that just worked, and I was just going to use album nodes. It worked immediately. I basically Composer installed it and then hit the API. Contenta didn't work that way for me when I initially worked with it. I think I might have been a little early on it, or maybe I just did something stupid. That's entirely possible too. But I have used Contenta on projects since. I like it quite a bit as well. But I used Reservoir and it met my needs really well for this project. So now we've got to talk about getting our data from that ugly Google spreadsheet into Drupal somehow. So it's a bit of an exaggeration, but what if I told you that it was just all so easy? And that is sung by Kenny Loggins on this track on Thundercat's album. The Migrate API, we'll dig into it in a second, but what it can offer us for getting some of this data into our Drupal instance is really kind of amazing. And the other thing, since we're referencing this song, I think it was Show You the Way on Thundercat's album, for people at the conference who may be socializing or drinking, this is actually useful information. Everyone, please hydrate. If there's one thing that you take away from this talk, always hydrate. I feel like not everyone is taking that advice seriously. What are you going to do? So how, in God's name, are we going to get data out of a Google spreadsheet and into our Drupal instance? And I want to avoid saving like a copy of the spreadsheet or including it in the repository, because during December, when all these lists are published, I wanted to be able to get on a pretty regular basis the most recent version of that data from the source, which this dude Rob, who was nice enough to share this information, maintains in the Google spreadsheet because he's crazy, I guess. I don't know. Drupal Migrate can help us quite a bit here. I created a custom Migrate module, which also installs the album content type that I'm going to use. To do that, I put through the UI, built the album content type, and then used Drupal console to export it with their no UUID, no config hash option. And then using the Migrate Plus JSON migration, I can actually pull right from the Google spreadsheet. We'll look at how that happens in a second. And then also as part of the migration process, I'm augmenting the data that I bring in with some data from Spotify using Spotify's API. Because there are a few additional things that can help make the app a little bit more fun if we do that. So this is a weird little hack that I learned about that makes this possible to actually hit the Google spreadsheet data in place. If you go file and then publish to the web, or email the guy who maintains this Google spreadsheet and ask him if he would do it for you, and then say automatically republish when changes are made, then you're going to get this URL that you can hit. As long as you provide the document ID, you can get a JSON response that has all the data from your Google spreadsheets, believe it or not. There's a little weirdness in kind of the paths in the response and some of the naming conventions. But once you wrap your head around that, the data is all there in real time waiting for you, which is awesome. So now we can take a look at the migration itself. Pretty small. I hope everybody's eyes are up to the task. So this is the YAML file that defines our migration in this case. And it lives in the AOTY migrate module, config install, and we specify an ID and a label and all that stuff for the migration. And then we're using a custom source plugin here. We'll look at that next. But basically what that does is, mainly in this case, it's what we use to interact with the Spotify API. And then we're fetching HTTP, and we are parsing JSON, which makes sense given what we just saw. We provide our ugly Google Spreadsheet URL. And then this item selector here, it's basically where in that response we're going to get the items that we're migrating in. So it happens to be feed/entry. And then we define the fields that we're going to be migrating in. So we give it a name, a label, and then from that feed/entry point, a selector. So there's a bit of a weird naming convention and a $T that actually has the string value. Once you figure that out, you can map all of the fields. And then we're saying that we're going to use the node destination plugin to save these as album node types. And then after that, we basically just map the source fields to the fields on the album content type. And this is the album source plugin. And that lives in AOTY migrate plugin migrate source. We're including the Spotify web API for PHP, which worked pretty nicely for my needs. And then we are extending the URL source plugin and implementing prepare row. That's where most of the work goes on here. So we create an instance of the Spotify web API, start a session, and get a token back. That's what that block of code does. And then at that point, we can interact with the Spotify API and perform a search. So that's really what we're doing here. We're just searching. We're using the album field in the spreadsheet, and that has both the artist name and the title of the album, which actually gives us a pretty good string to search Spotify for and get a relevant set of results back. And then at that point, we just, from our Spotify response, we pull some data that we make use of. So there's the Spotify album ID, and once we get that, we can do things like link over to Spotify to play the album. We could embed songs and things like that. And then the Spotify API also has the album art in a number of different sizes, which is really useful to be able to include in an app. And then we just return the modified row back to the migration. And then at that point, more like migrate, am I right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Everybody took that more seriously than the suggestion to hydrate, so we'll talk later. But yes, we have all of our data as album nodes in our reservoir instance now. And if we edit one of these albums, Kendrick Lamar in this case, which is without question the critical darling of last year, we see all the data that we expect to see. We've got the title, album title, genre, the averages, links to the cover images, all the rankings for all the lists. So now we have all this cool data sitting in Drupal, ready for us to interact with. Okay, deep breath. So now we get to talk about the React end of things. And yeah, there's a lot to talk about here. And the thing that I would also stress here, giving the kind of the poll of the room, I think a lot of us are probably on the same page, but I was pretty new to React when I took on this project, learned a lot along the way. But to quote Jay-Z, I would say, I'm a guy who's been to Paris 2 times and has seen, the Eiffel Tower. I know some things about React, but certainly not everything. But I'm going to focus on kind of the high-level learnings that I had putting together this app. Hopefully it's useful. So, spoiler alert, this is what the app ended up looking like, and we'll go play around a little bit and see what it is. So there was a spinner there, and we're loading in data from Drupal. We'll talk a little bit more about how we might be able to eliminate that process, the loading process. But so here we get by default the cover view. So we see rows for all of the different albums. And if we click on an album, the detail panel on the right-hand side has the cover art. And there's a little link here to play the album on Spotify. So we see Melodrama on Spotify. Any Lord fans? Yes, nice. Couple Lord fans. All right. And then there's also the rankings on all the lists that it happens to fall into. And we can click through and see the list. And you'll see where it ranks on the 50 best albums on Stereo Gum. And then there's also a control panel here on the side that slides out, so we can do things like restrict the number of rows that we're displaying. And there's filtering capabilities. So we can filter by the artist, album, or genre. So my favorite album of the year was by The War on Drugs. So if I type in war, I see a deeper understanding by The War on Drugs, and all the albums or artists that have the word war in it. Updates very quickly as I type in my search string. I can type for hip hop, hip hip, hip hip hooray, and get all the hip hop albums of the year. And Kendrick Lamar still unsurprisingly at the top of the list there. And then there's a couple of other views that we can switch between. So this is just a simple table view here. It uses a component from the Blueprint.js component library, which had a number of nice building blocks. But I also found that this was a really good place to start. I had a few initial attempts at this project, and I tried for something too ambitious. Like I said, I'm going to start with a bar chart. Instead, just getting a table and getting the data that I'm familiar with in the spreadsheet from the Drupal API and have it show up in this table that I can then sort and filter ended up being a really good starting point for me. And then there's also this list view, which is a heat map visualization, and a whole lot of stuff here, but we see all the lists and then the data that happens to be in this result set, 50 rows. And we get to see where everything ranks on all the different lists. It gets interesting if you do something like pick a list here. So if I say Rolling Stone, it resorts the data set based on Rolling Stone's list. So we see it just running right down from 1 to 50 there. And then you can kind of compare where Rolling Stone has similarities to other lists. Like if we look at the third row here, we see that U2's Songs of Experience was number 3 for Rolling Stone and did not chart on any other list in this data set. So way to go with your gut, Rolling Stone. So yeah, that's
had nothing to do with he was interviewed.
Yeah.
The issue after that.
I haven't heard the album. It might be amazing. I don't know.
It came out in December too, so it could be another reason.
Yep.
True.
We got a U2 defender.
I didn't say the album was great.
Is there anyone who can defend U2 in this room? Everyone's still mad that album ended up on their iPhones, I suppose.
Also, they just
I'm renaming this talk to Bustin' U2's Chops. Okay, so anyway, that's what the app does. Feel free to poke around online and try it out. But I thought it would be helpful to kind of look at what it does in context before we look at some of the component parts a little bit, which we'll do now. Or after I take this sip. Okay, so the question I had to ask myself is, how do you start a React app? I didn't know how to do that. And as I mentioned, I took a few attempts at this. And initially when I started trying to learn more React, it was before Create React app existed, which we'll talk about in a second. But you had to do more Webpack configuration and maybe get a boilerplate that you work with. And there was more that you had to do to kind of get your local setup going for development before you could actually get into the exciting part of learning and playing around with React components. Since then, Create React app has been released, which is maintained by the Facebook team. And the idea here is that it lets you bootstrap a React app really quickly and hide some of that configuration behind the scenes, so you don't have to worry about it unless you need to. So I installed Create React App as a global package, and then you can run Create React App and provide the name of your project. There's a new recommended way to do this now. I think more recent versions of NPM have a command npx that basically lets you do these two things at once. So if you happen to look at it, that's what they recommend doing now, but not what I did. And then if you're familiar with installing things via NPM, there's going to be all kinds of crazy outputs that I certainly do not want to copy and paste into this fake terminal. And then you can, if you change directory into your project, you see all the files that create React App bootstrapped for you. And if you run npm start, it's going to start a little dev web server for you, and it'll load in your browser. And it also does pot module reloading, so if you change things in your app, it will automatically refresh and update in your web browser. And then you can also run npm run build, and that is going to build a production-ready bundle for you that can be your assets that you deploy. And also, beware, there are dragons ahead. But so I mentioned that it hides a lot of the configuration behind the scenes to make it easier for you to get up and running with writing React code. There's also the concept of ejecting, so you can run npm run eject. And what that does is it exposes all that configuration so that you can optimize things or change your Webpack config as you see fit. And what I would say is don't be embarrassed if you use the default configuration of Create React App as long as it makes sense for you. Just know that you can get out there and change it if you have to. So for this project, I actually have never ejected it, but for this slide deck, ironically enough, I had to be able to get the slide deck working the way that I wanted it to. And it wasn't the end of the world, although I did see some cool dragons. Okay, so now, starting to build the React app a little bit. A couple ways we could go, but one thing that we might want to ask, especially because we were just talking about our friend Drupal, is how are we going to get that data from our API into our app? So there's a handful of ways that you could do that. You can use a library like Axios, which is kind of similar to jQuery's Ajax methods. But I wanted to use the JavaScript fetch API, try that out. So I created a little utility function that lives in source utilities, and it takes an endpoint, defines an array of albums, and then we call fetch with the endpoint, and fetch returns a JavaScript promise, which reminds me to also say that some of the JavaScript code we're going to be looking at is going to be using ES6 syntax, which I'm sure some people may or may not be familiar with. But if you see anything that you're not quite familiar with that looks a little bit weird, that's why. But I'm hoping it's going to be generally understandable enough. So anyway, we call fetch, and we get a promise back, and then we are going to chain a few promises together to resolve that data and act on it. So here we're resolving the response as JSON data. And then we're taking that data and doing a few things with it. So if first we're taking the data and we're putting it in the albums array. And then if there is a next page of results back from our JSON API endpoint, we are going to call getAllAlbumData recursively to get the next page of results. And if there isn't, then we'll just return the album data. JSON API, I found out that there's no way to just get all of the data, which, while frustrating initially, makes a lot of sense because oftentimes that's probably a bad idea. But that's why you have to do something like that. And then also there is a little error logging if something goes wrong. But with that, we can get all of the data from our endpoint. And for this particular app with just the data for 2017, it performed fine if I just got all this data up front so that we had it available in the app. I do want to in the future have like multiple years worth of data, and I don't think that approach will be practical. We'll need to, based on the year or based on some other interaction, hit the API a little bit more frequently. But keeping things simple here. So now we have the data in a big object in our app, and we can start rendering it. So we're going to look at a example component. This is the album component. And we see Kendrick Lamar, again, since he won. He's always the example. So we have our component on the left-hand side, and then on the right, this is an example of a render method that's rendering out the album. And what we see there is JSX. So So that's a markup syntax that's used in React that lets you use HTML-like tags and elements to render your components. It gets converted to JavaScript, but you can use things like divs and H1s and elements that you're familiar with. But you can also use custom components, custom elements that you define. In this case, it's the album. And then they can accept properties. So here we're passing in as props a bunch of the data that we need to use to render that album. So we've got the artist name, the album ID, a cover image, things like that. And so with in React, if the data, the props, or the state, which we'll talk about in a second, if any of that changes, it's going to automatically re-render your component, or at least figure out if it needs to do that, and any components that might be children of it that are inside of it, which is part of why it feels so performant and responds so quickly. So we can actually just update things here. And as we update our props, things are going to update in real time. So I'll just, something goofy. There's something great about changing damn to darn. I also have a cover image of the War on Drugs album that I dug so much. So there might be actual string values that get passed in here, but also commonly it might be a variable or an object or something like that. So I can replace this with these squiggly brackets and use my war cover variable here. And now I have the War on Drugs album art for Kenny Loggins' Darn. So that's a look at what the JSX for a component might be like. So now let's take a look at this album component and how we actually build it in JavaScript. So this is our album component, album.js, which lives in source components in this project. And we're importing React. And also prop types. We'll talk about prop types towards the end of this file. And we are extending the React component class. There's a handful of different ways that you can define a component. Extending React component kind of covers all cases, so it's I think the best way to explain these as examples. If you have a simple functional component that maybe just takes props, there's more stripped down, simpler ways that you can define this. But there's going to be a render method, and the render method returns JSX. And there's a little bit of logic here. So if we have a cover image, we're going to return one version of the album component that has an album cover. And if we don't have that, we're going to return a slightly different version of that component. And then it's all JSX here. So we see things like album row. And you can think of that as another custom component we've defined. The truth is actually a little bit different from that, and we'll get there. But for now, just think of it as a custom React component. But then there's also stuff like an image tag and an H4 and things that we know and love. Or some days don't love at all. And we're also making use of our props here. So we know the props that we expect to be passed in, so we can do things like this.props.coverImage to display the cover image, this.props.title, etc. And then also up in album row, there's an onClick handler. And that, when you click on the album row, as we saw, it highlights it and populates the panel on the right-hand side. So it can call functions like that. And those functions could be defined in the component itself, or they may also be passed down by a parent as props. And we'll also see some examples of that. And then this is just the stripped down version where we don't have an image. And then these are the prop types. So prop types is just a simple way to kind of validate some of the props that come in. So just really simple, basic, but we're expecting a string here, we're expecting a function here, and it'll complain if it gets something different, which is nice. And then we export the album component so we can import it elsewhere in our app. So that was the basics of how we would create a component. And we talked about props. There's also the concept of state in React component. And props are really kind of external influences on your component, data that gets passed into it. State is more what the component knows to be true about itself, and variables that are managed inside of the component. So a way to illustrate that is thinking about our control panel here. We have things like the little list to sort and pick list. So I just created a stripped down version of that in our little preview panel here. There's enough code, I'll go full screen. So if we want to define some state that lives in the component, we create a constructor. And then we define the variables as constants that we want to use. So there's selected sort, which is set to field constStore, and then selected list, which we default to none. And then we can set state in the constructor. So this dot state, and then we have an object that has selected sort and selected list. And then below that, I'm binding a couple of functions that we'll look at in a second. I typically don't do that. If you use ES6 arrow functions, it automatically binds that stuff. But for whatever reason, I had to do that in this little preview pane. We'll skip over the functions for a second and just look at the render method. So it's returning JSX again. And it always has to return one top-level wrapper. So that's why we're wrapping it in a div. But then we're accessing our state here. So we say that we're just printing out this.state.selected sort to say the current value for selected sort. And then for the select list, we're setting the value to the value in state for selected sort. So whatever the state of the component is set to is what that select list will have selected as well. And then when we change it, we have an onChange event, we call this handle sort change function that's defined in the component. And really all that does here is it just updates the state to whatever you select in that select list. So we just take the event and we use set state and we say that selected sort is the value that's picked in the select list. And all that to do this. So if I go and pick average, the value in the select list is now average, and we show that the state here is average. So again, the state is more the kind of internal representation of the component. And I think it's kind of, well, for me, let me get out of here. It was a challenge for me to kind of understand those two concepts, props and state, and wrap my head around what they really did. But then it took me a while to really understand where I would and wouldn't use state mostly. And there's a common pattern in React of lifting the state up into higher components in your app. And so I'll talk a little bit about kind of what I went through there. But so take the album component that we had. I'm initially building that. I know about props and state now. I know maybe enough to be a little bit dangerous. And I'm like, okay, it has a cover and a title and an artist name. So it's probably going to have all those things in the state of the component. And then I keep building, and I'm building the detail panel. And it has a lot of the same stuff. It has at least like the artist name and the album title. So I'm like, okay, well then it probably also needs to have state for those things as well. And now I'm trying to manage that in two places. I click on something, and I have to go update it in both places, and I filter the list, and it has to update the state in the album component and the detail panel component. So that doesn't feel right. So then the idea there is that you would take your state and you would lift it up to one of the higher parent components that are going to render these things. So then at that point, I take the visualization, and maybe that's where it needs to live. the cover view is where that state lives. But then I've also got like the list visualization and the table visualization, and those are using the exact same set of album data. So you don't want to manage that big object of album data in each of those visualizations and have to update each one as things change. And the control panel also needs to know about some of this stuff, at least like how many albums are displaying and things like that. So where I eventually ended up is that the almighty app is what has a lot of this state. And it's really passing down all of that data into the components as props. So it's passing all of the album data into the visualization, and then that visualization renders each of the albums with all the information. And then another thing that I didn't really talk about, and we're getting kind of deep into React stuff here, but the state in a component can only be managed by the component itself. They can't like reach into other components and mess with their state because it's what they believe about themselves. So the app will also pass down functions to some of its children so that it can go all the way back up to the app and change the app's state. So it's getting a little complicated, but the basic idea here is like if you want to be able to filter in the control panel, if you pass down a function that can do that, it can go back to the app and say, oh, I'm supposed to filter for hip hop. So hey app, we're going to use hip hop now, and then the app passes all that data down, and because whenever the props change, things re-render, everything magically updates when you filter. But all that is managed at the top. It took a while for me to wrap my head around. I'm probably making people's eyes roll back in their heads a little bit if they're new to this stuff. If you are familiar with React, you may be thinking that this would be a situation where you use something like Redux. And Redux is a library that helps you manage state in your app in a consistent way, in a very deliberate way. And I think if I was to either do this again or maybe next year if I do some work with the 2018 data, I probably would do that. But instead I'm just managing everything at the top of the app, but passing things down quite a bit, or passing the albums to one component and then their children and passing functions all the way. So that was definitely hard for me to wrap my head around. Another thing that was really hard for me to wrap my head around is styling in CSS and JavaScript. When I saw what people were doing here, I got it, but to paraphrase, I was flabbergasted. And this Priest album, if anybody has not heard it, it will rock your face off. It's a good album. So let's talk about how we style these things. So you can create a CSS file like you might be familiar with, and import that into your component. And then you have access to all those styles in your app. And then in your JSX, you can use the class name prop to use the appropriate class. Not class, but class name, because it's got to be like that for some reason. And that'll work. That's totally fine. But as I dug into this, all the cool kids are writing CSS and JS for some reason. And when I learned that, especially when I saw what it actually looked like, it was definitely a facepalm situation. That's a candid picture I took of my son one day when his mom was away, and I was just going to send her that, and I took that picture, and I'm like, I can't send this to her. She's going to wonder what's going on with him. But it definitely describes my feelings when I first saw how some of these approaches to CSS and JS actually works. So what I ended up using is the styled components library. So here we're importing styled components. And then when you do that, you can define these constants that basically let you create a little inline React component. There's this album row thing, which we saw before. It technically was a styled component. And you can say that it's a styled div, or it could be one of the other components, custom components that you've built. And then you can define the CSS right in line here in your JavaScript file, which initially felt very horrible and very wrong. But as I took this approach, it started to make more sense to me. One is that everything actually really does live in one place in this component. Another is that it can also respond, your styles can respond to the props that are passed into your component now. Excuse me. So this is a really simple example But if the album component has the active album prop, we click on it, it becomes active, then we can change the styling and put that blue border around it. So that's really nice. We don't actually have to go like we do in like a jQuery approach maybe, and update class names and juggle a bunch of class names together. The component itself just knows what its state is and can make itself look how it thinks it should make itself look in that case. And there's more complicated things you can do with that, but it's actually pretty nice and useful.
So those are all inline. Like if you were to inspect the thing and you changed it, it would just all be inline JavaScript, CSS that gets just put in there.
Yeah. So what it does, and I haven't gone too deep into like the actual nuts and bolts of what happens, but it actually gives basically like a nonsense class to that element in the DOM, and then that class has all the styles. But yeah, the other thing that does is it prevents these styles from leaking out. Because it's got this nonsense class name, there's no way that class name is going to be used anywhere else. So other tangential components aren't going to pick up these styles. They will apply to the child, but they're not going to leak outside. And I don't know if people have used naming conventions like BEM in some of their CSS styling. That's kind of a pretty heavy-handed way to try to, in my opinion, achieve that same effect, but with still having styles that apply globally. So this image, people may have seen this, but this made a lot of sense to me when I saw it. In that I know I have been taught that there's a particular separation of concerns between like JavaScript and HTML and CSS, and that mixing them is bad and wrong. But as I started to build things this way, it actually makes a lot of sense to me that like my album component, that's where the separation of concerns is. And I have this nice, wonderfully packaged album component. All the stuff is in there, and it knows how it's supposed to behave. And that actually makes a lot of sense to me. So let's talk about building and deploying. Have just a little bit of time here. Bit of a racy album cover. I hope it's still within the acceptable rules of what I can put on screen in this conference. Nobody get too excited. But all right, I have this app, and where can I go? Where can I put it? So let's talk about the JAMS stack a little bit, which was in the title of this talk. Took me a while to get to it, but we're here. And what the JAM in JAMS stack stands for is JavaScript. APIs, yes. The A in JAMS stack stands for API and markup. Okay, so that's the stack that we're dealing with here. And let's look at that in relation to this app that I've been blabbering on about for a good 50 minutes now. So the JavaScript, it's React on the client side. And that's an important distinction in what I understand to be the JAMS stack, in that it's client-side JavaScript. Preston had his Decoupled Drupal across the stack talk yesterday, and in a lot of his examples, there was a universal JavaScript or like isomorphic JavaScript component that handles via node on the server side the first request. A Jamstack app is specifically not doing that. The JavaScript runs on the client side. And then there's an API. And, the definition of API is pretty broad. In this case, it's our Drupal API, and you can put it anywhere you can Drupal, which is great. And especially for this app, it kind of doesn't matter where it is as long as your app knows where it is, but it doesn't have to be like a easily publicly available thing. And then there is markup. And in this case, it's the npm build production bundle that I created. And you can put, because it's just that static set of assets, you can put that a lot of different places. For example, I just put it up on GitHub Pages. And boom, now I have this app that's on GitHub, which is great. I would say that it's not really as static as I think some of the Jamstackiest of Jamstack apps could be. It's a little bit more on the single page app side of things, but it still falls into the category, I think. However, like looking at the markup piece of this and drilling into that, the static markup, I feel like that's the kind of secret sauce here, in that typically the markup is statically built markup in these Jamstack applications. I've been also experimenting with Gatsby, which is a React static site generator. And that's definitely more on that side of things where it is statically building your whole entire site. But the question that I want to ask myself about this app, and also as you start to get away from the lamp stack stuff that you might be familiar with and are playing around with this sort of stack, is to ask yourself, is there more of this app that can be static? And even just thinking about this app, I think there definitely is. So that first request that we have, we saw the little spinner when it loaded, and it's hitting the API, and we got to load the data and then render everything. But really, that first request is always going to be the same 50 results. So there is no reason why I couldn't have made that first page static, or essentially act as if it is static, and then get the data behind the scenes and let you filter it. And then also beyond that, there's also the fact that it's only really December where this data is changing. So the data itself kind of lives statically in there. But there's more I want to do to try to take advantage of the static aspect of this and make it feel even faster on that initial load. But haven't quite gotten to it. So really quickly, almost out of time, but let's get to the hot melodrama here for all the Lord fans again. Something that I was asking myself as I was building this is, did we really need Drupal for this project? No, we didn't. Maybe though. So if you're somebody who is familiar with this stack and have a way that you can easily build an API, something that you're comfortable with or have done a number of times before, then you're fine. Do that. And that's absolutely great. And I'm sure there are really experienced React developers or JavaScript folks who have their go-to way to do that. It might be something like Firebase or Express, but I don't really know any of those things. But in my case, it was definitely a yes. So I'm familiar with Drupal, and a lot of people here are probably familiar with Drupal. And somebody I think who has some level of familiarity with Drupal, but wants to have an API that powers something like a React app, really can be served well by those API-first distributions. It was really easy for me to get set up and going. And then I think it's also so effective, and some of those distributions are so easy to get up and running, that if you actually don't really have a go-to thing for this, it's worth checking out even if you're not a Drupal person. Because really all you're looking for is a really reliable, consistent API, and the things that you can do within the admin UI to update your API is pretty great. So I don't think there really is a black and white answer. It's definitely a yes for me, but I would certainly also understand if somebody who's like, I use, icecreamcone.js to make my backend. That's what you do in JavaScript. And I'm not going to complain. So it was fun putting this together. Hope it was interesting to people. We might have a couple of minutes for questions. Also, it's my first time giving this talk. I'll be giving it in a month in Nashville, so I would really appreciate any feedback that anybody has about how this might be more interesting or useful to you. But thank you. Any questions or anything? Yes.
So I think one good use case for that is when you actually have content lived in Drupal, that you need content editors to actually add or change certain parts of that data. And I would think, yes, Drupal will really fall into place as an API to feed your different applications. Because you can have multiple endpoints. Like let's say you had multiple sheets from different people, and also some other comments attached to something, then I think that this would be a really great way to kind of put them together and start on your point.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would agree. Yes.
You said that this was all client-side React, right? So there's probably no authentication that you have set up with your Drupal API?
There isn't.
Okay.
So the distributions also have simple OAuth, so that's definitely something you can configure. I didn't really care if people could get the responses from this endpoint.
Right.
I made sure you can't post to it.
Yeah. Does React have a server-side component as well that you can use if you wanted to put credentials and things like that on the server side?
I believe it does. I haven't done anything with it.
Okay.
I've only been to Paris twice.
Did you find new music?
Did I find new music? Actually, I've been listening to the Kendrick Lamar album because I see it so much. And when I first listened to it, I don't know. I had trouble coming along to it. I tried to listen to his past albums, but it's awesome. It's really awesome. Sometimes I feel like an idiot if I'm blasting it at my desk while I'm writing code, but it's really good. It's kind of like a good mix of all of his different styles all in one place. All right. What?
I have one question. So what do you think would be the difference in using Reservoir and CCAN? Like what would be the two different, like, because I think CCAN serves as a data point, right, to store your data.
I'm not so familiar with CCAN.
It's kind of like an open data portal distribution for Drupal. So I was kind of like want to know like if you have any idea of like the differences of like the pros and cons of using the API first distribution like Reservoir compared to the distribution of CCAN, which is used for open data.
Yep. I haven't used it, so I really don't know. But I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, partially from my perspective, it's just making that API accessible, and whatever does that in a way that works for you is kind of fine. So I think the biggest advantage to these distributions is giving you that API without you really having to think about it. All right, I'm out of time, so thanks. Thank you.